Welcome to the Jay-Z Show. I think this is episode 4. I'm Zafar Sobhan, tuning in from Dhaka, Bangladesh, and John Danilowicz, I believe, is joining us from Alexandria, Virginia, uh, this episode. So, John, tell me, what has been on your mind this last week? What do you think we're going to be talking about?
Great, thanks, Zafar. It's great to see you, and greetings from Alexandria, Virginia. So I'm just outside Washington, D.C. I can report that despite what you may have read in the media, the United States military is not occupying Washington, D.C. It's been a beautiful weekend, and I've enjoyed spending some time with family. But Bangladesh is never far away from my thoughts, and I did have the chance while here in D.C. to catch up with a couple of Bangladeshi friends who live in the area. So one of the things that we talked about, which is very much on my mind, is what's happening in Bangladesh as the campaign season begins. I mean, certainly we all saw the violence involving VP Noor and the aftermath. The rumors that were flying around after the army chief met with the chief advisor met with the political parties, the discussion of banning the Jatiya Party. So I'll be very interested in the perspective on the ground in Dhaka of how all this looks. I'll tell you though, from several thousand miles away, I mean, obviously, first it's expected, it's natural. As once the election schedule or the date was announced, increasingly the interim government was always going to become a lame duck. So I think you see part of the focus shifting from the interim government to the other political actors as they jockey for position. For me, though, one of the topics that's foremost in mind and was a subject of some of my conversations here was what quality of election can we anticipate? And the chief advisor referred to this in his statement after his meetings with the political parties, reiterating his commitment to deliver the best possible election. But one of the things that has come to mind for me is that for the interim government, as well as the political parties, everyone has a vested interest in seeing the election be held as cleanly as possible with the highest turnout. So that means that beyond appealing to people to support individual parties or candidates, I think everyone has a vested interest in seeing that there's the highest possible turnout. So there's obviously a tension in this because with the Awami League banned and possibly other parties being banned, there's certainly a risk, if not an expectation, that their supporters may stay home. So I think this will increasingly be the main focus going forward. But curious how things look on the ground in Dhaka.
Yes, I mean, when I tell you how things look to me on the ground, that may not necessarily be a good reflection of how things look to the general population or other people. So keep that in mind that this is my own personal idiosyncratic take on what's happening in Bangladesh. I feel again, and I think this is a sort of a motif which which has been a recurring one in our conversations. I often think that there's a lot of sound and fury about this and that, but actually, at the end of the day, there's much less than meets the eye. So, of course, you have the meeting between the army chief and the chief justice, and I know people who say that this was the third attempt by the army chief to foment a coup, and for a third time he had been beaten back and had been thwarted. Now, I mean, to me, I just don't really see. I mean, it's not clear to me when I talk to these people. Well, if he wants to foment a coup and take power, with what agenda? Okay, what exactly is in it for him? Why would he want to do such a thing? You never get very good answers to that, and I think people love to see oftentimes very innocent or whimsical actions is being very much part of some greater plan, or they like to see that there is some overarching scheme or strategy in place, and oftentimes there just isn't. And I think one of the things to understanding Bangladeshi politics is that more often than not, there is no overarching strategy. People are very reactive rather than proactive, and things unfold. And depending on how they unfold, people respond to them in differing ways. And I still think that's where we're at. Getting back to the attack on VP Noor, for instance, again, I don't think it was any I don't think it was any planned assault. I mean, I think he and his supporters went to try and create trouble around the Jatiya Party headquarters, and that's also an issue because I think even his strongest supporters will concede the fact that they were there to try and cause trouble and break up a protest, a democratic protest of what is, at least now, a duly constituted political party is actually something which should not be supported. That said, then
Talking about the fact that the VP knew that it wasn't planned, and you were going.
Yeah, I mean, I think with all of these things, it's just spur of the moment action and excess by the law enforcement authorities. They are tasked with creating peace and stability. And honestly, this is all they know how to do. When you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. You task Bangladesh police and Bangladesh military personnel with restoring law and order in a situation like that, in a highly volatile situation. I don't think they're trained to do anything other than what they actually did, and I don't think that they had any preconceived plan to sort of show Noor a lesson or anything like that. I think, as I said, there's less to it than meets the eye. Now, it's certain that it needs to be investigated, and certainly I'm not condoning police brutality and police excesses, and those who had command responsibility need to be brought to book. Those who were guilty of violating the human rights and the civil rights of the protesters need to be brought to book. But that's very different from thinking that this was just some grand scheme which has a greater significance beyond what happened that evening. Similarly, I mean, I would like to talk about what happened at the Dhaka Reporters Unity a few days back, when Latif Siddiqui and others were there trying to have a discussion on on the 72 Constitution and the Liberation War. And then this was, of course, completely disrupted by elements of those, I hesitate to say that these are necessarily people from the NCP or student leaders. I don't think that much is so clear, but certainly it would be people who are their fellow travelers and who have similar political ideology. And then, of course, the police came, and rather than arrest those who had disrupted the event, they arrested on spurious grounds those who were actually the victims of the disruption and those who are in fact trying to hold a peaceful event. So we are continuing to see that. And again, I don't think that this is the product of any great strategic scheme on the part of the law enforcement authorities. I think it's more a product of muddle-headedness. It's more a product of the fact that they have not been given good instructions, they have not been given good training, and that there's a fair amount of intimidation which they feel when they enter into the situation, and they feel that the safest thing for them to do is to not confront mobs and not confront angry crowds. And again, like I said, there's no great backstory there, and I think that's something which we have to look at. Moving forward, I'd love to talk a little bit about, what does this mean in terms of the upcoming elections, because it's now September, and so we have, we're in the final stretch, into the final 6 months. So what are your thoughts on that, Jon? Do you think, I think you mentioned in your opening address that, we really need to start pivoting and focusing on elections. How do you see that playing out?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, again, this is all a phased transition. There was obviously the 15-year period of the previous government, the tumult of last July and August, the interim government establishing itself, the reform process, and then ultimately, as the year anniversary came, the July declaration, the announcement of elections. So we're in a new phase, and everyone realizes that. And there's still, I don't think, a consensus on what the rules of the game are. or frankly, even who the arbiter is. And as you pointed out, there's various power centers that people look to, appeal to, and the army is always, looming over everyone's shoulders, and the army chief's actions and words are going to be interpreted in that way. But there's other players as well. The election commission has been pretty quiet, at least from my perspective, from what I pick up in Bangladesh, but they'll increasingly have an important role to play. It's interesting, I saw that the U.S. Head of or chief of mission, the Chargé Ambassador Jacobson, met with the chief election commissioner just a few days back, and she's going about doing what a diplomat does, which is meeting with a variety of stakeholders. But what was notable for me was the fact that she actually gave or spoke with the press afterwards, and she's been very quiet. Compared certainly to her predecessors, previous U.S. chiefs of mission during election cycles. So the fact that she chose this opportunity to speak out, to reiterate support for the interim government's election schedule and, the commitment and the importance of elections, I thought was notable, with the U.S. kind of putting its, thumb on the scale to a certain extent. And all the players obviously have to figure out what roles they're going to play. And there's legitimate and illegitimate ways to, engage in political activity, violent and nonviolent ways. So we're seeing this play out. I mean, there's a lot of discussion among people I talked with about election boycotts and who's going to participate. I mean, clearly the BNP has the greatest incentive as the, presumed front runner to see the elections take place and to then prepare to govern afterwards, presuming they win. Many observers think that the Jamaat Islami is in the best position to, say, come in second, head the opposition. Yet there persist rumors, reports, theories that Jamaat itself doesn't want to see elections, planning to boycott them. Again, from my interactions with Jamaat and my read of the situation, I just don't find that credible. I assume that they will participate, and from what I can tell, they're fully preparing. Individuals, smaller parties are positioning themselves as they do. To me, the real wild card in this, though, is the NCP. And there could be, certainly I think from the NCP's perspective, with the emphasis they place on reforms, they would have the strongest argument for why elections should be postponed, because it tracks with their belief that the system fundamentally has to be reformed first. I think they lost that argument with the weight of opinion both inside and outside the government saying that elections need to take place. So the NCP has some decisions to make, whether they participate in elections or whether they stay out. This to me is a different question of whether they would then actively try to prevent the elections from taking place, which I don't think they would do. And frankly, I don't think they have the ability to do at this point, given how things have evolved. But at the end of the day, it's a decision by any political party whether or not to participate in elections. And that'll be based on a calculation of what's in short and longer term interests. So again, I think one of the challenges in any political system is that, elections by themselves are competitive. There will be jockeying for position. There will be criticism of opponents, and that's all fine within the boundaries of what the rules are. I think the challenge in Bangladesh and elsewhere is when people step outside the rules. So, referring to the incident that you mentioned or the attack on VP Noor, certainly it can't be seen as acceptable that the way to deal with political opponents in an election campaign or otherwise is to use violence and beat them up and try to eliminate them in that way. And, I think as we've talked about before, the government has a important role to play as well in ensuring a level playing field. And this is where the issue of, the continuing arrests of people who are perceived as supporters of the previous regime comes into play. There are people who deserve to be behind bars. There are people who deserve to go on trial. But it can't be the case that simply taking somebody a piece off the board by arresting them under spurious charges is acceptable. So this, I think, for me, kind of stepping back and thinking of what's best for Bangladesh going forward and what best positions the next government is for everyone to have this consensus that, look, we're in a new phase. It's a competitive electoral phase. Everyone needs to agree on the rules of the game and then play by them. And I'm hoping that was the main message that the chief advisor tried to get across to the political parties when he met with them, and to the extent to which the army chief and the chief advisor need to be in close communication. They're in some ways the two referees, right? They're the ones that, from the civilian and the security side, have to ensure that the political parties, abide by the rules.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it seems to me that certainly both of them, General Wakar as well as Professor Yunus, I think are very committed to elections, and both, for similar reasons. And the reason why I think most major constituencies are also committed. I think if you look at people like the business community, they would like to see elections. I don't know of any large scale constituency in Bangladesh which doesn't want to see elections, with the possible exception of the NCP and maybe some of their supporters. And even within the NCP, it's my understanding that there is a difference of opinion. You have a certain faction who think that we should go and have elections sooner rather than later, and you have a faction which would then like to hold off until we see more reforms. See, the trouble with the reform formulation is twofold. The first is that, I think we would all like to see greater reforms before election. That would actually not be a bad thing. However, the ability to reach a sufficient degree of consensus such that these reforms can be enacted and implemented remains very much in question. And it's so much in question that it's not really a question of delaying the election from February to June to December. It's really a question of, well, look, will we ever be able to get to do this? So, and I mean, I think more and more people are thinking that under the current dispensation, it's really not going to be possible. And the second point is, of course, the current situation under an interim government is inherently unstable. They have done, I think, a creditable job holding the country together over the last 1 year, but the fact remains that an interim government is inherently unstable. You talk to people in the business community, no one will like to invest. No one is going to, make a big economic play until they understand that there's going to be a more permanent government in place. And that is just common sense. So on the one hand, I think this government's one of their great achievements and accomplishments is stabilizing the economy. And I think they deserve an enormous amount of credit for that. And I think they take some tough decisions, and I think Ehsan Manzoor at the Bangladesh Bank is probably the one who should get the most plaudits for righting the economic ship of state. But I think I will give credit across the boards. I think there are many people, starting from the top with Professor Yunus, who can justifiably take credit for righting the economy. But righting the economy and then growing the economy are two very different things. And so I think they've been the right government for the first, but they're probably not the right government for the second. And I think when it comes to elections, and I am much more bullish on this than many people, because of course we've had tremendous bad luck, and the history of elections in Bangladesh is not a happy one. There have been, literally, you can count on the fingers of the one hand the elections which have generally been accepted as free and fair. That said, I think having a free and fair election is not, in fact, actually a difficult task in the slightest. And most of the problems we saw in the past, it wasn't as though we were unable to divine the fact that the elections are not free and fair. It's just we weren't able to, and those of us in the media weren't really able to write about it, and people at the population level had no recourse to do anything about it. But actually getting people to go in and cast their vote and then count their vote ought not to be a very difficult thing to do. And I think one of the problems we've, of course, had in the last 15 years is when you have the government machinery in charge of the election, then, of course, that clears the pitch considerably. But if we do have either, there's talk of bringing back the caretaker government for this election, if not ones in the future, or the interim government, if they don't have a dog in the fight, then, things can be much more transparent. Even if you just at a very basic level, if you have tens of thousands of people or thousands of people go to voting centers and just hang out there all day, it becomes very, very difficult for people to stuff the ballot box or seize the voting centers in the stuff we've done. And so that kind of citizen activism can really actually take care of the election system and make sure there isn't that much skullduggery. Similarly, in America, for instance, you can audit elections. You can go to the state of Arizona at the end of a presidential election and say, look, I'm going to subpoena all of the ballots and I'm going to count them myself. And this is what people actually did. I think they did it after the 2020 election. And and if you have that power, that you can actually go and talk about this, and we go and say, okay, give me the ballots and I'll count them myself. Or if it's done electronically, it's even much easier to count because you have everything. You can you have printouts. You can look at all of that. It's not complicated technology to make elections much, much more fail-safe. You just have to have the political will, which is what was lacking in the past. So I really think if the final goal of the Yunus administration is to hold a good election, I really think that they can do that. And I think if they're able to do that, then that will, in fact, cement their legacy. And so I think that being the case, there's a lot of keenness to make sure they get this right. I think it'll pave over a lot of the perceived shortcomings and wrongdoings over the last 1 year, and they'll leave on a high. So I see it all coming together. Like I said, there's a small faction. Yeah. No, I'm just saying there's a small faction within the NCP, I think, which is right now opposing the elections, but I think they'll come round. And I think part of it coming around is we do need to see concessions on the part of the BNP. The BNP is now negotiating as though they hold all the cards, which isn't exactly the case. And so if they give a few concessions, I think we can come to a situation where everyone is happy.
Right. And, the other part of this is you have to look at this as you're playing chess, not just playing checkers. So obviously the next big event is the elections. And then there's the election aftermath. And how will the party or the parties who win the election govern? And the track record on this is obviously mixed. So, if you look at the good elections in Bangladesh's history, I would argue that the 2008 election was a good election. I mean, all of those criteria were met, even if the BNP will, still complain about that election. And maybe there were issues in the pre-election period, which are justifiably subject to complaint. But actually on the election day itself, I think the election was good. But that good election didn't lead necessarily to a good outcome. So part of this, I think, is the individual players have to think about how they're going to interact and act after the election. So on positive signs, which we always look for, on the BNP founding anniversary, the fact that the NCP greeted the BNP on its founding anniversary, given the tension between those two, I think was a good sign. The parties showing that while they'll compete at the polls, after the fact, they'll have to work together. So again, on the VP Noor incident, the degree to which all of the parties condemned that attack, and people understand, the consequences of violence. And again, I think about this from the victor's perspective, or the presumptive victor. And a scenario I've been thinking about a lot is the 1996 February elections, again, when the BNP was in power. You could see a scenario where, there's a good election. And again, I'm not, an expert on that election period itself, but the problems with the 1996 election really ended up having to do with turnout and legitimacy of that election. So if I were the BNP, if I were Tariq Rahman, what I would be most worried about is a situation where an election takes place. Technically, the election looks good. The BNP wins with a significant mandate, but that election itself is not seen as legitimate. In some ways, that's the situation Hasina and the Awami League faced after the 2024 elections. So this is, again, where paradoxically, I think from the BNP's perspective as the presumptive frontrunner, it's in their interest to have as many people come to the poll as possible. And frankly, to some extent, it's in their interest to have a lot of people vote against them, even if, they obviously want to come out on top. So it's a delicate balancing act for the BNP. And on the BNP, I still am befuddled by the fact that Tariq Rahman has yet to return to Bangladesh. He's saying, frankly, and doing all the right things from London. I just think it would be so much more effective if he were on the ground in Dhaka saying and doing those things. And beyond that, he would have that opportunity to start building those relationships with the people he's going to need to govern with after the election, to start with, the other constitutional bodies, the business community, civil society, the students, etc. So it's a difficult task for political parties and politicians. They have to think in the short term what maximizes their interests, and yet they have to look to the longer term. And I'm not exactly sure how that's all playing out. And then finally, the international actors. I'm sure the United States and all the other countries that have interest in Bangladesh are also trying to position themselves for what happens after the election. So we'll see the lines building outside the door of those who are presumed to be coming into power after the election, and maybe less interest in those who are currently in power.
Yeah, I mean, I think the elephant in the room in this discussion is the fact that Awami League will not be taking place. And once upon a time, when you asked me, certainly this was my position when the Awami League held an election without the BNP, both in 2014 and in 2024, that, an election without one of the major political parties in Bangladesh is, it is problematic. Now, in the scheme of this current situation we are in, a year on from the July uprising, a year on from the massacres, this is a slightly unique situation. It's not really the same as what we saw in 2014 and 2024. Nevertheless, it creates a problem. It creates a potential problem for the BNP. It creates a potential problem for the Election Commission. So I think it is therefore incumbent on the political parties to make sure that they can get as much inclusion as possible. So Awami League is out, okay, but you certainly can't afford to have the NCP out. You certainly, in my opinion, cannot afford to have the Jatiyo Party out. I think that would be the ultimate folly. You want to create a situation where this election is absolutely as inclusive and wide-ranging as you possibly can. So I really think that should be the focus of the BNP over the next 6 months. I would even counsel them that they would, if it requires concessions to the other parties, that it would be very, very worth their while in terms of the optics created if they gave them those concessions. And, I think that my sense is that as we get closer to the election, sanity sort of will prevail. And speaking on your issue about Tariq Rahman, again, I think part of the thinking process is maybe that people's attention span is so low now. So if you roll him out a little too early, you don't get to maximize the input which he will be able to put in, and you want him just for that 90 days. The danger, of course, and many other people have alluded to this, is that in his absence, it does seem as though the BNP is not really under a unified command. There's all kinds of stuff happening on the ground, which is being condemned by the senior leadership, but continues to go. And I think it is very important that he comes back to rein that in, because to the extent that people are losing faith in the BNP and they're becoming disillusioned with the BNP, it is precisely to do with these kind of petty corruption, criminality, what we call in Bangladesh toll collection, which is really a euphemism for extortion, which is going on all around the country. And if you don't really, put a lid on that, that is going to impact BNP's electoral fortune. So, it is something they need to take very seriously. But what I've not seen, and what I've loved to see, that I think I'm going to leave it on this, is I have not seen any party give a real meaningful manifesto in terms of the focus of what are they going to do when they come to power. BNP does have a 31-point program, but I still think that that's not quite what I'm looking for in terms of really getting an understanding of what are the concrete steps the BNP are going to take in order to govern well. What is their relationship going to be with the other parties? What is their relationship going to be with the Awami League who are in jail? What is their relationship going to be, with all of the people who have become, from the administration to the police, who are compromised by their relationship with the past regime? These are all very difficult questions which we need answers on. What is their India policy going to be? It's a great question. What will their greater foreign policy be vis-a-vis the United States, China, and Russia? These are huge questions. And the NCP and the Jamaat don't even have a beginning of an answer to these questions. So I would like to see in the next 6 months the discussion focus on policy and what we can expect from these parties post-election. I think if they did that, that would be a great. I think they'd be doing a great service to the Bangladeshi people. They'd be doing themselves a service because, of course, we've never had these kind of issue-based elections. It's usually been personality-based, tribal-based, whatever you want to call it. But I think the time has come for these things to change a little. And I do have confidence that the interim government will be able to hold a legitimate, free, and fair election. I see no reason why they wouldn't be able to do that. So I hope that the upcoming election really does deliver for the Bangladeshi people and will set a foundation for good governance, at least over the next 5 years. So I will finish on that optimistic note. John, your final thoughts?
Yeah, no, those are all important, I think, topics for us to continue discussing, the kind of the up to the election, then what happens afterwards. And then obviously there's the international dimension. And later this month, Professor Yunus will be back in New York for the UN General Assembly. So maybe in the next in the next or a future installment, we can talk a little bit more about this international context. But with that, it was great talking with you again, and we'll pick this up next time.
We'll pick it up 2 weeks from now. And to our audience, I promise that between now and the next 2 weeks, me and John will find something that we disagree on, because I think that will make for yet more compelling viewing and hearing. So thank you very much, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks.